Deep in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like the ghosts of forgotten sins, there stands a cabin that local folks won't speak about after dark. The floorboards still creak with the weight of secrets too heavy for any foundation to bear. And if you listen closely on certain nights, when the wind cuts through the pines just right, you can almost hear the echoes of a story so disturbing that 3 generations of mountain families have sworn never to tell it. But tonight, we're going to tell it anyway. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In 1923, a circuit judge traveling through the remote mountains of Appalachia stumbled upon court records that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Buried in a stack of yellow documents was the case file of Delilah Mae Whitlock, a woman whose story had been deliberately buried by a community too ashamed to acknowledge what had happened within their own bloodlines. What that judge discovered wasn't just a tale of family dysfunction. It was a multi-generational nightmare that revealed the darkest corners of human nature when civilization's watchful eye turns away. This isn't a story about poverty or isolation, though both played their roles. This isn't even a story about mental illness, though madness certainly crept through the Blackwood family tree like poison through mountain water. No, this is something far more disturbing. A chronicle of how tradition, silence, and twisted loyalty can transform a family into something that barely resembles humanity at all. The locals called her Devil's Daughter, though never to her face. They whispered that she carried the mark of her sins in her eyes. One blue, one green, like God couldn't decide whether to bless or curse her. But the truth about Delilah Mae Blackwood runs deeper than superstition. It runs deeper than shame. It runs all the way down to the bedrock of what happens when a family decides that their bloodline is more sacred than the laws of God and nature combined. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from court documents, diary entries, and the testimonies of those brave enough to break decades of silence. Some of these details have never been made public. Some probably shouldn't be. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep you bury it. The Blackwood family had been scratching out a living in the Kentucky mountains since before the Civil War when the first Josiah Blackwood claimed a patch of rocky ground that nobody else wanted. They were what mountain folk called ridge runners. Families so isolated that the outside world might as well have been another planet. No mail came up their hollow. No preacher made the treacherous climb to their door. And that's exactly how old Josiah preferred it. By 1890, the Blackwood homestead had grown into a small compound of rough-hewn cabins connected by covered walkways like a fortress designed to keep the world out and the family's secrets in. Josiah's son, Ezekiel, had inherited more than just his father's land. He'd inherited his paranoia, his contempt for outsiders, and his unshakable belief that the Blackwood bloodline was somehow special, chosen, set apart from the common rabble down in the valleys. It was Ezekiel who first began preaching what he called the pure doctrine to his children. He'd gather them around the fire on winter nights and tell them that God had blessed the Blackwoods with superior blood, that mixing with outsiders would dilute their divine essence, that their family was like the biblical patriarchs who married within their own tribes to keep the bloodline sacred. The children listened with wide eyes as their father quoted twisted interpretations of Scripture, weaving together fragments of Genesis and Leviticus into a doctrine that would have made any real preacher sick to his stomach. But it was Ezekiel's daughter, young Mary Catherine, who truly believed. She absorbed her father's teachings like dry earth drinks rain. And by the time she was 16, she was already helping him spread the pure doctrine to her younger siblings. When Mary Catherine married her first cousin, Jeremiah Blackwood, in a ceremony performed by her own father, Bain, and their family chapel, the mountain community barely raised an eyebrow. Cousin marriages weren't uncommon in those isolated hollers. After all, what they didn't know was that this marriage was just the beginning. Mary Catherine had already been pregnant twice by her father before she married Jeremiah. Pregnancies that ended in stillbirths that the family buried in unmarked graves behind the main cabin. And when she finally bore a living child in 1891, a daughter they named Delilah Mae, the entire family celebrated the birth as a sign of God's approval for their pure doctrine. But Delilah May Blackwood was born into a world where the definitions of family, love, and duty had been so twisted that she would never know where one ended and the others began. Delilah May's childhood was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as religious devotion. From the moment she could walk, her grandfather Ezekiel would take her by the hand each morning and lead her to the family chapel, a converted storage room where handwritten scripture covered every inch of the walls, verses carefully selected and edited to support the Blackwood doctrine of blood purity. She learned to read using her grandfather's annotated Bible where entire passages had been crossed out and rewritten in his spidery handwriting. By age 7, Delilah May could recite from memory the twisted genealogies that Ezekiel claimed proved their divine heritage. She knew that Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, that Jacob married 2 sisters, that the sons of Adam must have married their own sisters to populate the earth. What she didn't know was that normal families didn't gather in circles every evening to discuss the spiritual benefits of keeping bloodlines uncorrupted by outsider poison. Her mother, Mary Catherine, had by this time become something between a religious fanatic and a broken shell of a woman. She spent her days in a constant state of nervous energy, always cooking, always cleaning, always preparing for the next family ceremony or ritual. She spoke to Delilah May in the cadence of biblical prophecy, calling her the chosen vessel and the pure seed of the covenant. When Delilah May asked why she looked different from the children she occasionally glimpsed in the valley below, why her eyes were 2 different colors, why her left hand was slightly malformed, her mother would clutch her close and whisper that these were signs of God's special favor. The truth was far more sinister. Delilah May's distinctive features weren't marks of divine blessing. They were the physical manifestations of generations of inbreeding, genetic abnormalities. The ad would have sent any doctor running for help. But there were no doctors in the Blackwood compound. There was only family and family doctrine and the growing certainty that Delilah May was being groomed for something that went far beyond normal religious instruction. When she turned 13, the nature of her education began to change. Ezekiel started teaching her about the sacred duty that awaited her, the role she would play in keeping the Blackwood bloodline pure for another generation. He spoke in biblical metaphors and cryptic references, but the message was becoming clear. Delilah May wasn't just a member of the family. She was its future. And that future required sacrifices that would make Abraham's willingness to kill Isaac look like child's play. The mountain winter of 1904 would be the last time anyone saw Delilah May smile. What happened to Delilah May during the winter of 1905 can only be pieced together from fragments. A torn diary page found years later stuffed between floorboards. Testimony from her younger brother who finally broke his silence decades later. And the chilling court records that would eventually surface. But the picture that emerges is one of systematic grooming disguised as spiritual awakening of a 13-year-old girl being prepared for horrors that her isolated upbringing had taught her to accept as divine will. Ezekiel had begun holding private covenant ceremonies with Delilah May, rituals that took place in the root cellar beneath the main cabin where the family kept their winter stores. He told her these sessions were necessary to prepare her for her sacred role as the vessel of the pure bloodline. The ceremony started with hours of prayer and fasting, followed by readings from the carefully edited scriptures that emphasized the spiritual importance of family unity. Then came the physical purification rituals that Ezekiel claimed were modeled after Old Testament practices. Delilah May's mother, Mary Catherine, not only knew about these ceremonies, but actively participated in preparing her daughter for them. She would dress Delilah May in white robes that she had sewn by hand, anoint her with oils made from mountain herbs, and whisper encouragement about the holy purpose she was fulfilling. In Mary Catherine's fractured mind, she wasn't delivering her daughter to abuse. She was presenting her as a sacred offering to preserve their blessed bloodline. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as any physical harm. Delilah May was told that resistance would anger God, that doubt was a sign of spiritual impurity, that her discomfort was simply her mortal flesh rebelling against divine purpose. When she cried, she was told that tears were prayers. When she tried to refuse, she was reminded of biblical women who had suffered for the greater good of their people. Every normal human reaction was reframed as either weakness to be overcome or holiness to be embraced. By spring of 1905, the damage was done. Delilah May had been transformed from a curious spirited child into something resembling a sleepwalker, present in body, but absent in spirit, going through the motions of daily life, while some essential part of her had retreated so deep inside that it might never surface again. Her grandfather proclaimed this change as evidence of her spiritual maturity, her acceptance of God's plan for the Blackwood family. But Ezekiel's plan was just beginning. The ceremonies in the root cellar had been preparation. What came next would ensure that Delilah May could never escape, never tell, never find her way back to the person she might have been. In the summer of 1906, when Delilah May was 15, the Blackwood family held what they called the Great Covenant Ceremony. For weeks beforehand, Mary Catherine had been preparing special foods and decorating the family chapel with wild flowers and hand-carved symbols that Ezekiel claimed were ancient Hebrew marks of blessing. To any outside observer, it might have looked like preparation for a wedding. In the twisted logic of the Blackwood doctrine, that's exactly what it was. The ceremony took place on the night of the summer solstice with only the immediate family present. Ezekiel presided wearing robes that Mary Catherine had sewn from black wool, while Delilah May stood before him in the same white dress she had worn during her purification rituals. Her younger siblings, 3 brothers and 2 sisters, all born from the union between Mary, Catherine, and her own father, watched from the shadows as their grandfather spoke about the sacred duty of bloodline preservation. But this wasn't just religious theater. This was the moment when Ezekiel formalized what had already been happening for months. In front of his assembled family, he declared Delilah May to be his covenant wife, bound by divine law to bear children who would carry the pure Blackwood bloodline into the next generation. He quoted fabricated scripture about the spiritual power of multigenerational unions, about how the prophets of old had practiced similar sacred marriages to maintain their connection to God. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Delilah May stood through the entire ceremony like a statue, her mismatched eyes, staring at something beyond the candle-lit chapel walls. When it came time for her to speak the vows that Ezekiel had written for her, she recited them in a voice so hollow it might have been coming from the bottom of a well. The words were about duty and purity and sacred purpose, but they might as well have been a death sentence. By October of that same year, Delilah May was pregnant with her first child, a pregnancy that the family celebrated as proof of God's approval for their practices. When she gave birth to a son in the spring of 1907, they named him Ezekiel Jr. after his father and grandfather who were the same person. The boy was born with severe physical deformities that the family interpreted as marks of divine favor, but which any medical professional would have recognized as the tragic consequences of extreme inbreeding. This was just the beginning. Over the next 8 years, Delilah May would give birth to 6 more children. The Blackwood compound during those years became something that defied description. Part nursery, part asylum, part monument to human depravity. Delilah May's children, all fathered by her own grandfather, bore the devastating genetic consequences of generations of inbreeding. Some were born blind. Others couldn't walk or speak properly. One daughter, born in 1910, had such severe developmental disabilities that she never progressed beyond the mental capacity of a toddler, though she lived to be nearly 30 years old. But Ezekiel saw these deformities as signs of divine blessing, proof that his family had achieved a level of spiritual purity that transcended earthly concerns about health and normality. He would hold each newborn up to the light streaming through the chapel windows and declare them angels sent by God to bless the pure bloodline. The more severe their disabilities, the more convinced he became that they were touched by the divine. Delilah May herself had become something barely recognizable as human. Years of pregnancies, trauma, and psychological manipulation had transformed her into a hollowed caretaker who moved through her days like a ghost. She rarely spoke except to murmur biblical phrases that her grandfather had drilled into her. When she did interact with her children, it was with the mechanical tenderness of someone going through the motions of motherhood while her soul had fled to some unreachable place. The other family members had fallen into their own patterns of dysfunction. Mary Catherine spent her days cooking enormous meals for the ever-growing household while muttering prayers under her breath. Delilah May's younger siblings, her uncles and aunts, who were also her brothers and sisters, had been so warped by their upbringing that they saw nothing abnormal about their family structure. Some of them had begun forming their own inappropriate relationships within the compound, creating an even more tangled web of genetic disaster. By 1915, there were 17 people living in the Blackwood compound, and nearly all of them shared DNA in ways that nature never intended. The isolation that had once protected their secrets was now trapping them in a spiral of genetic and psychological destruction that grew worse with each generation. Ezekiel, now in his 70s, had begun talking about preparing the next generation of covenant wives from among his own granddaughters. But the outside world was beginning to take notice. Modern roads were creeping closer to the mountain haulers. Government officials were starting to ask questions about families who never appeared in census records. And in 1917, a forest ranger hiking through the area would stumble upon evidence that would finally crack open the Blackwood family's terrible secret. Forest Ranger Thomas Mitchell was tracking a wounded deer through the dense Kentucky wilderness when he first caught sight of smoke rising from what his map showed as uninhabited territory. Following the thin gray line through the trees, he discovered the Blackwood compound, a cluster of ramshackle buildings that looked like they had been forgotten by time itself. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life and eventually lead to one of the most disturbing court cases in Appalachian history. Mitchell's initial report preserved in the Kentucky State Archives describes a scene that seemed to come from another century. Children with obvious physical deformities wandered the compound like lost spirits, many of them unable to speak coherently or care for themselves. The adults moved with the shuffling gait of people who had never learned to interact with the outside world. And at the center of it all was Delilah May, now 26 years old, but looking decades older, surrounded by children who called her both mama and sister, because in their twisted family tree, she was both. The investigation that followed Mitchell's report took nearly 2 years to complete, partly because authorities struggled to untangle the web of relationships that had developed over 3 generations of inbreeding. When the truth finally emerged in court documents, even hardened law enforcement officials were sickened by what they discovered. Ezekiel Blackwood had not only abused his own daughter and granddaughter, but had created an entire ideology to justify and perpetuate these crimes across multiple generations. Ezekiel himself died in custody before he could stand trial, taking many of the family's darkest secrets with him to his grave. Delilah May was removed from the compound along with her children and placed in state care, but the damage was already done. She never fully recovered her ability to function in normal society, spending her remaining years in a psychiatric facility where she would sometimes speak in the biblical cadences that her grandfather had drilled into her decades earlier. The Blackwood compound was burned to the ground by court order in 1920, but the legacy of what happened there lingered like smoke in the mountain air. Local families still whisper about the devil's daughter on quiet nights, though most of them have forgotten that Delilah May was not the source of evil. She was its victim. The story of the Blackwood family serves as a reminder that the most horrifying monsters are often those who wrap their cruelty in the language of divine purpose, who use isolation and twisted doctrine to justify the unjustifiable. In the deep mountains of Appalachia, where civilization's reach grows thin, some secrets are buried so deep that they take generations to claw their way back to the surface. But they always do. Truth has a way of surviving even when everything else turns to ash.